All right, welcome everybody to the SIG Network meeting for Thursday, September 17th, 2020. First item on the agenda, also please add any other agenda items to the bottom. Just a note that we will be enabling passcode on the SIG meetings starting next meeting. That's a request from for all SIGs for Kubernetes to deal with moderation issues, Zoom bombing, that kind of thing. There's a link there with a little bit more information. The passcode will be 5 7s for all SIGs. So keep that in mind and use that next time if you see a passcode request.
Just to clarify, is that going to automatically apply to all SIG network meetings?
That's a great question. I personally haven't looked to see what it's going to take to enable that.
Okay. Yeah, it'd be great if it could just automatically apply to service APIs and anything else as well.
Yes, it
but
would.
let me know if okay, great.
All right, yeah, I'll take a look at that somehow. Tim, Casey, and I will figure that out and let everybody know. All right, next up, issue triage. Do we have somebody lined up for triage today?
I wasn't planning to share, but I've got it open.
All right. You touched it.
Finish loading these tabs. All right. Oh, computer's crashing. Give me a minute. All right.
Yep, I will do that. Give me 1 second. All right, give it a shot now, Tim.
How's that?
Looks good.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. I've been having some trouble with Zoom web client and getting audio glitches, so please scream if you can't hear me if it glitches out. Also, my kids are about to get online for school again, so I might start fighting for bandwidth. So let's do it. All right. Starting at the top. Support multiple cluster siders in Kube Controller Manager by our very own Anthony.
So that ties in with the issue below that we could talk about that Jay brought up and that Surya both brought up.
Should we just pause this one then?
I think so. It's more a question of what do we do about these kinds of things. Should we support multiple everywhere in Kube? And should we expose those values somewhere outside the cluster? I think there's a couple of paths we could take there.
Although, I mean, this one is probably wanting actual feature work from Kube Controller Manager as well.
Yep.
Like dividing up multiple node siders.
Yeah, I mean, all right, let's push this one. Let's leave this issue. We'll come back to it. Next, drop packets in invalid state drops packets from outside the pod range. And Kube proxy is configured with a cluster side range.
So this actually kind of ends up being similar too, in that it wants Kube proxy to have a better idea of internal versus external packets.
Which means it probably needs to know the cluster cider if it doesn't already. Or, oh wait, it does already.
Sometimes.
Well, it says here when it's configured with a cluster cider range, I suppose we assume the user has configured it correctly and it still drops packets.
No, at the moment it doesn't look at the cluster cider at all.
Ah, okay.
But we wanted, we took a bunch of PRs at the end of last year to make kubeproxy not look at the cluster cider, right? The goal being that kubeproxy shouldn't need to be aware of the cluster cider for almost anything. And so this was the multi-cider work that Satya was doing, if you guys remember that, which goes to the previous issue. But I'm trying to understand what this one's about.
So we added a bug fix that sometimes if you lose packets and then you get an incoming packet, it will cause, because of IP tables and contract weirdness, it will cause your long-term connection to suddenly be dropped, like a long-term connection from outside the cluster to a service, or maybe the other way around. Anyway, we added a fix for it, but it turns out that it breaks people who are doing crazy things with multiple interfaces and stuff like that. Asymmetric routing, yeah, there we go. So they're saying we need to limit the rule in kubeproxy that drops invalid packets. But it gets hard to do that well because kubeproxy doesn't necessarily know which packets it is and isn't supposed to be. Or which...
what was the, I'll have to read context on the invalid fix. I guess I missed that. What causes those invalid packets?
If a packet gets dropped and then contract sees a packet with the wrong sequence number, it ends up like not getting natted or unnatted correctly or something. And then when it sends back the response, the peer sees the packet. I mean, you'll have to read it and get all the details, but it ends up causing the peer to send a reset and kill the connection because IP tables and contract are doing the wrong thing, basically. And so we worked around it by dropping the out of sequence packet before IP table sees it.
So something triggers the contract record to go into invalid state?
No, it's invalid. Okay. It's out of sequence. And
it's interesting that would apply to the entire contract record as opposed to just dropping that packet.
In the interest of time, should we punt this one for now and continue on GitHub?
You can assign it to me if you want.
I will assign it to you, but I'm going to read it to try to understand. Okay. E2E test failure, error in waiting for Ingress to get an address. Ingress failed to verify address within 10 minutes.
I've been taking a look into this one, but I need some sort of view from Bowie because this seems to be related to GCP or GCP and not to...
Yeah, assign it to us. I thought we fixed it because there was a whole bunch of these. So just assign it to me and we'll see if it's due of the previous stuff.
Great. I've made a PR, Bowie. I don't know if you want to take a look because I think that's only because that's not assigning an IP address. So.
Okay. For broader context, there was some discussion with SIG test folks that I had last week about whether it makes sense in the long term to have the project's E2E tests that are being exercised via the cloud provider logic, or whether it would make sense to write a fake ingress controller that just came back and said, like, yes, end to end, this did in fact do the right thing, but not actually waiting for provisioning. It would make E2E tests a lot less painful and flaky, but we would lose out on some little bit of actuality of the testing.
Tim, do you have a reference to that discussion?
No, it was email. Eric Feta brought it up as an idea around the test flakiness mess.
Okay.
It was very casual discussion. It wasn't like plan or cap or anything. It was just like, what if we did this? DNS E2E test cases fail with IPv6 traffic.
Yeah, assigned to me. I mean,
Who was that?
most of the time is because the core DNS needs to reach the upstream servers. Oh, I'm good.
You got it.
Thanks.
To everyone else who's watching the triage, remember, we're not asking you to fix the bugs. We're just asking you to help triage them. So don't be shy. Feel free to sign up. Kube proxy configuration API tests are not validating errors correctly. The kube proxy config API validation test. That's a long phrase. Kube proxy's config API validation test.
I think we can. Chris already assigned this to himself. I think he's going to fix these tests.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Good point. Thank you for pointing that out. Jay's already assigned himself this one. Are you okay with that, Jay?
Yeah, but Tim, I guess if you could look at that at some point, it's kind of an open PR. It's for the test.
Is there an open PR on this one? So I apologize to everybody. I am about 3 weeks behind on everything right now because Google just went through our perf process. So I'm just coming out the other side this week. So if there's a PR for this that's assigned to me, I will take a look at it ASAP.
Okay, cool.
Awesome. Unable to reach core DNS servers.
I think this one is mostly resolved now. If you go to the bottom, I forgot. I think it's working. He just had to reboot his machines. So it sounds like he just had like IP tables was screwed up or something.
Cool. I'm going to stick your name on it since you were dealing with it. Thank you very much. And feel free to close it if you're happy with the resolution. It sounds more like support than a bug.
Yeah.
Move host port manager to staging or out of tree. The package kubelet docker shim network host port is used by Pinter runtimes to manage the pod sandbox.
I think
The
this
host
is
port manager.
of the move to get rid of Docker shim because
Yes.
Cryo is currently vendoring this code, and so it'd be good to have it. Problem is that it depends on IP tables and contract in package util. So,
and this is because the host port code is wrong. I don't know if you remember, Tim. We talked last week, I think. That is not using the host IP.
Well, that's a bug, but the rest of it, most people don't set host IP, right? So for most people, it works.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm giving you context because I asked Sasha to,
Okay.
and they wanted to vendor, and for vendoring they wanted to staging. I mean,
yeah. So I don't object to the idea of moving it out. I question whether it's, I don't know. I mean, like you said, it depends on IP tables, which takes a big dependency.
So question, what's wrong with relying on the CNI plugin port mapping instead of this implementation?
So one problem with the port map plugin is that it can't hold the listening socket open, which means you can't do the magic keeping people from opening host ports and node ports and host network daemons at the same time.
So let me ask you a question. How valuable do we think that really is? I wrote it because I thought it was going to be really important. 5 years later, I'm a lot less convinced that it matters.
If you require host ports and node ports to be in different ranges, maybe, but if you just get rid of that, there's a possibility that people could steal ports from other pods.
That's true. We have sequencing. Okay, you know what? I'm going to assign this one to myself because I want to think about it. Anybody else wants to participate in the discussion, please speak up now and I'll stick your name on it, or just jump in and follow along. Come on, GitHub, you can do it.
Is that a sign?
Yeah,
You
time
can
check.
do
We
it,
started
come on.
triage a bit late, so let's give another couple of minutes and then move on to the rest of the agenda. Maybe 2 more issues.
Okay. Sure, we're getting into stuff that was older than our last meeting anyway. Problem with resolving host names timeout to external data. Sometimes it works. Oh, it's always DNS. Anybody, we've got a core file here, so they got some tweets. Somebody wants to help convince us that it's a bug or that it's a headcack?
I think I can take this one.
Oh, you're already assigned.
Yeah, I'm assigned. I just
that.
forgot to look at it. Yeah, I'll look at it.
Okay. Ambiguous help message in kube proxy is assigned to one of Dan's. Any progress here? Proposed a fix here. Awesome.
Shoot.
Have we had a chance to look
for
at
a
the
little
fix?
bit? I have not. I will do that.
Okay. Server-side apply results in superfluous modified events for endpoint resources. This is assigned to Rob and Jenny, right? Remember we looked at this last time and we commented on what a great bug it was.
It is a fantastic bug. I think it's partially been resolved now, maybe entirely. I'll follow up. Yeah, let me. So it's partially on server-side apply side and partially on the idea that maybe we don't need to be doing this inside a storage strategy.
Okay. Okay. I will yield the floor then.
All right. Thanks for triage, Tim. The next item on the agenda is feature stability plan for dual stack. Dan, you're up.
Yeah, we were kind of like, we went over all of the KEPs and stuff last week, but I was wondering, do we have any plan for when dual stack will become beta? Or even thoughts? Hopes, dreams?
Sorry, you cut out for me for a second. Can you say that again?
I was just, has there been any discussion? Do we have any theories about when dual stack, like, do we think we want, or could dual stack go to beta in 120? Assuming we merge the thing soon.
Yeah, like I said, I'm about 3 weeks behind. How are you feeling about overall?
You're cutting out a lot now.
Cal, are you here?
I did not see him in the list.
He's on vacation, right? I think he told me in the last meeting.
It makes sense. The PR hasn't been repushed in about 2 weeks.
So I know in the last meeting, we talked about probes and how kubelet doesn't handle dual stack probes. I feel like at the very minimum, that should be one of the requirements to go beta. I don't know if other people think differently.
You mean health checks?
Yes.
Okay. Does that need a KEP, or do we adjust the existing dual stack KEP stuff, or what are the next steps there?
I guess we would adjust the existing KEP. What does the KEP say currently, actually, I guess?
I don't actually know. I just know that when we're talking about services, we kind of brushed off.
Right. I meant, like, what does the KEP say about the plan? I think it just had, like, in 1.7, we'll go to phase 3 and
You mean about the plan? I think that it is GA right now.
Capability will move to beta when the following criteria have been met. Kubernetes types finalized, CRI types finalized, pods support multiple IPs, nodes support multiple CIDRs, service resource supports pods with multiple IPs, KubeNet supports multiple IPs. So I guess Kubernetes types finalized is the missing thing there. And I guess when do we know that they're final?
That's a good question. I mean,
But it sounds like,
Can anybody hear me?
Yep.
There you are. I was about to say, it sounds like Tim is gone.
No?
We can hear you now.
I'll try. I think the criteria here is that we can convince ourselves and someone like Jordan that the API machinery changes are sufficient.
if we have to solve health checks, might we need some additional API? It seems like that's part of the conversation. There's a couple ways to go there, but I don't feel like we've really discussed that.
Yeah, and I feel like services, like dual stack services, would be incomplete if we didn't do like readiness probes correctly.
Well, but readiness probe, well, yeah.
I'm less convinced. Like, do we have a clear use case for why we need dual stack probes as opposed to just primary?
I open a PR just for that.
I mean, we support services of the wrong IP family, right? So theoretically, that seems like we ought to support pods of the wrong IP family as well.
I don't know what you mean by wrong there.
Like, if your cluster is IPv4 primary, we still allow you to make a single stack IPv6 service. Presumably the only reason
Yes.
why you would do that rather than having it be a dual stack service is if you had pods that only listened on IPv6.
Right, of course, and the pod IPs are not in accordance with this service IPs.
Right.
Right, okay. Yeah.
At the very least, we need a proposal in the KEP for what we should do, whether that is do nothing or do something, right? So,
Well, Antonio was just saying he filed a PR against it. So,
but we should still probably clarify in the KEP what we
he filed a PR against the KEP.
Ah, okay.
Proposing.
Got it.
One answer.
I mean, it's to discuss, so I added my answer, but doesn't mean anything.
Can you link that into the minutes so that people can follow and add their own discussion?
If you have that link handy, Antonio, can you put that in? Thanks. All right, so that at a minimum needs to happen. We need continued review and rework on the CAL's dual stack PR. Is there anything else besides those things? And besides convincing ourselves that the API will no longer change? Is that it? Anything else people can think of?
Well, the immediately following agenda item, I guess.
Well, yes. Okay. Well, we'll leave it at that, and that's some good stuff to work on before next time. So please, everybody who has a stake in dual stack, do these things and help out. So next up, load balancer IPs for dual stack.
Yeah, that'll be me. I have an issue with the load balancer IP because it's single stack, and in the status section it has always been an array, but it hasn't been used as far as I know. But now we need to use it to be able to specify load balancer IPs for both IPv4 and IPv6. And I have suggested, like, in the same way as every other field, have an S appended to it and make it an array. And I wonder if that would be okay. I have volunteered to implement it when the big PR is merged.
But sorry, it's already plural. You just want to rename it?
No, it's singular and it's a string. I would like to have a parallel load balancer IPs as a string array.
On service?
Yeah, in the spec section there is a spec dot load balancer IP. Yeah, yeah.
Yes. Yeah, it would have to go through the same transformation.
It's the same as everything else. Before, I believe it's still in 1.19, you can specify a list of addresses in the old thing. It's not validated. So I thought I could cheat, but now it's validated, so now that doesn't work. This is no code change in Kubernetes. It's just for cloud providers and MetalLB, which I will update.
I think what Tim's saying is it's going to have to go through the same validation so that we make sure that you don't add more than two, and that if you have two, one is v4 and one's v6, and that it corresponds with the IP family policy.
And there's the conversion logic that defaults one from the other when they're set for old client compatibility.
So it's going to require some changes.
Yeah, but no, it's not handled by Kubernetes.
Doesn't kubeproxy look at some of those for something? I could be wrong.
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
It looks at the implicit field, which is already multi-valued.
Got it.
I think that people were using this for NAT64. I remember somebody reporting that was using this IP as IPv6 for IPv4 services. I mean, I think that theoretically you don't have to validate the family, because as Lars is saying, it's not Kubernetes who is setting the family there.
I think we would want to validate it the same way we validate everything else, wouldn't we?
I would assume so.
Yeah, I'm suggested that would be agreement between the user and the cloud provider, and Kubernetes just doesn't care about it. It's a convenient way.
But it's nice if the cloud provider can know that it's getting a consistent request. Like, you know, the cloud provider has to double check to make sure that the requested load balancer IP are the same as the target IPs that it's going to be load balancing it to. Then that's just creating extra work for every single cloud provider.
Yeah, true.
But I think that people were using that. So that's what I'm saying, is that if somebody is using that, we are going to break them. I don't know if this is situation, you know. But I remember somebody using or external IP or other to do NATSIS for.
My question in all of this is basically if the cap should be updated, or if this should be another cap or something that comes after the dual stack has been merged.
I think generally we're updating the cap as the concept of dual stack evolves. So this would be something that you would do as an update to the cap.
Yeah, and I had described it in this link, which is in the PR, which fell the wrong place, but I didn't know where to put it.
So I would think that for load balancer IP in spec, we would do the same as we're doing with external IPs. What are we doing with external IPs for dual stack?
We're nothing, I believe, which
that also seems a little weird.
Yeah.
I mean, external IPs has always been explicitly unmanaged, right? Load balancer IPs is part of the implied contract between service controller and cloud provider.
No, I think that's, so maybe we're getting confused here because I'm thinking load balancer IP in spec, but the cloud provider is load balancer IP in status. So I think Kubeproxy has rules for load balancer IP in status, but not for spec.
That's right. In the spec, you're asking the cloud provider for a particular IP address.
Right, and the assumption is that it would put that same IP in status, I guess.
That's the assumption. If it can get that IP address, that it will use it. Right. That's the request. Now, I'm git grepping right now, and I don't think we actually validate. We don't have any validation for it, right?
I believe the validation is very recently added because I could set it to a comma-separated list of addresses in 1.19, but now in the master branch, I can't do that anymore.
Oh, okay. So I think same cap, changing it to a plural list seems reasonable. Adding the same validation seems reasonable, but I guess I'm a little bit worried now. Anybody hear me? Am I still talking to myself?
Nope. Still talking to yourself, Tim.
Oh, damn.
Just kidding. You're not.
Now I'm answering myself? Huh.
You're
Lars,
worried because we've played a little fast and loose with that field in the past?
Yeah, I'm worried, like Lars says, I mean, a comma-separated list feels like it was a little bit out of bounds, but I didn't look at the PR that changed the validation. I probably would have flagged that as potentially breaking. Changing it so that it has to be the IP addresses, the families that match. If it's not families that match, I don't see how it would work, right? You can't have a v6 IP and then a v4 backend. I guess you could if it's a proxy. Lars, do you want to start a PR on the KEP and we can discuss it there?
Yeah, we should definitely do that and move on in the agenda.
Okay.
And yep, we can discuss there. All right, Jay. Zombie issue with cluster cider.
Yeah, so I just actually learned about this yesterday. I don't know. I was poking around and actually was talking to Andrew, and then I never realized that you couldn't get query service IPs from the API server. And then I thought that was kind of weird. And then there was an issue that somebody, I think, proposed that, and then someone else proposed that you just be able to actually query the pod ciders. And then there's those two issues, and then they both got closed or at some point. And so I was just curious about whether that's ever going to be a thing or not. We don't have to spend a lot of time on this because it might just be a kind of an open question that nobody owns. And if that's the answer, that's fine.
Sorry, the question is, should we be able to find out the configuration of those ranges?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean,
Like,
I know this has been brought up before, right? This whole idea of being able to query those and rip them out of the API.
Yeah.
Right now, it's like some kind of weird thing. You just send them as command line arguments, and
So they are I don't think we should expose them because they are implementation details of the default, but not exclusively only controllers, right? Like we know it's possible for service IPs to be allocated out of some other IPAM system, or not service IPs, pod IPs, to be allocated out of some other IPAM system. And so we like those fields may have no meaning in some systems. I wrote a bug a while back about node spec pod cider, which has the same complaint.
Also, some network plugins support multiple cider ranges for a cluster cider. And that's not really something that could be addressed in the API unless Cube decided to also support that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just a documentation thing then, because I couldn't find that anywhere on the internet.
I'd be really curious what people want to do with these values if they had them. It seems like it's, like Tim said, an implementation detail of how the network plugin sets things up. And I guess I'd expect that the network plugin implementing this would already know those values. So maybe there's a better way of doing what components that want to know these things do as opposed to reading the cluster ciders.
Yeah, I think it's the CNI people, I guess, in general. That's where we hit it was, we've got a CNI and it's like, needs to know what the service IPs are because it wants to set up some rules. And, the way it gets those right now is we have to plumb them through the install process. So
I agree around cluster cider, like the CNI should know that ahead of time. But I think there are some use cases specifically for service cider where like the CNI might need to know what that range is to route traffic in different ways. And there's no way to like easily query the service cider from the API server or anywhere. So like the users have to configure service cider into the CNI as well, which is inconvenient.
So if I can rant for a second, like one of the medium-term objectives still is to get rid of those places that have one cider. So it seems completely inevitable to me that eventually we end up with multiple service ciders. So we'd have to build that into the schema right away. But also that could change dynamically. So we've had customers who have built a cluster with X space for services and realized that wasn't enough, and then they want to know how do they add another cider, right? And the answer is really, unfortunately, you just can't do that. So one of the things that we started looking at was, can we make those things so that they are non-adjacent and multiple? We could still expose that through some API that you could query to get at it. And service cider is interesting because we currently do allocate it through the API machinery. Right? There isn't a way to plug in a different IPAM system for service ciders, which frankly feels wrong. Like it feels like it should be possible to implement services in a different way, but I haven't really put a lot of thought into that. But the bigger thing that I want to get to is this comes back to one of my long-standing grumbles that I wish I had enough time to spend thinking about it and doing something about it, which is our networking implementation is like shards of glass all over the system, and people don't know they're there until they step on them, and then they're grumpy that they cut themselves. Kubelet knows some about this. See the bug about host port manager, and kubeproxy knows some of this, and the API server knows some of this, and the controller manager knows some of this, and the network policy implementation knows some of this, and each of them kind of wants to know information about each other because they're not completely mix and matchable. And so I keep coming back to, like, I feel like the model is fundamentally broken. And we need to, if we're going to try to make these things more aware of each other, we need to make them more closely coupled in the implementation. So it would be completely reasonable to say that, you know, that this driver, let me back up. Imagine an omnibus driver that covered all of the various networking topics, right? And you pick one, right? So I'm going to pick the foobar network driver, and that includes which CNI I'm using, which services implementation, which network policy implementation, which IPAM, etc. And those things can all know about each other because they're all highly coupled. But from the outside, it's effectively a black box. I feel like that's the avenue that we would do better exploring. Rant over.
I think I'd agree with that. We're going to be held back somewhat by backwards compatibility, though, and I think that's evidenced by how long it's taking to remove some of these things from the API and like Docker shim. So I think it's the right path forward. There have been some discussions around this already. I think Dan and Chris Luciano have had some side discussions about this kind of thing. Perhaps we should formalize it more inside SIG Network.
So that doesn't help anybody in the short term. I mean, I'm totally on board. I would love to start brainstorming about this right after we get dual stack in. In the meantime, how much trouble are we making by not having any mechanisms or anything to offer here?
It means that your install process is a little bit more convoluted because you have to sprinkle these kinds of configs in a couple of different places and like substitute values into perhaps daemon sets or things like that.
Yeah, and I don't think we need like a full API to get some benefit. Like I think maybe a low-hanging fruit is like an API server endpoint that just gives you service side.
So what, isn't there this whole thing about component config and like everything is supposed to be moving to having configuration that would be stored in the API server?
I'm not sure like how much progress that's making. Last time I checked it stalled a bit.
Yeah, I mean, because I guess that all started years ago. And
even if we had component config for all these things, wouldn't something have to drop the right value into a couple of different component configs anyway?
Right, but yeah, that would be like either if you're building the cluster by hand, you would do that, or if you're using kubeadm or something, it would do that. Because the idea would be that this would be where the components were getting their configuration from, right? So you could get it from the same place that they did.
So at risk of contradicting myself, would it make sense for us to offer like an optional internally scoped CRD or something that was very specifically like, this is an implementation detail, and if you depend on it, you are, you know, inherently depending on the implementation. But here's some information you probably shouldn't know.
In 2 years, are we really going to be able to yank that if we have something completely different?
That's the risk, isn't it?
Yep. I mean, I guess I worry that so many things would begin to depend on it that it would be de facto standard API.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I think there's a argument for service cider at the very least, because we don't allow that to change.
But we were just talking about wanting to allow.
Well, yes, but
Well,
what I mean is, like, there's a difference between the current way that we do cluster cider or pod cider allocations in network plugins with their own IPAM versus what we do for service ciders, where the service controller is the thing that does it and you can't swap that implementation out. So either it feels like,
I mean,
go ahead.
For better or for worse, the only way that we currently offer to do service cider is through the API server, and it is going to track currently a bitmap of all the service IPs that it has allocated. Now, I know some customers have put like an admission controller in front of services, and they do their own allocation, but the API server still is going to validate it against the range and a bitmap, right? So because of that inherent limitation, maybe we have an out in that we could justify exposing some of that information, saying like that is unlikely to change fundamentally.
Somebody want to write up?
Are you still here? How is Gateway? Sorry, let me ask one more question. How is Gateway doing IP allocation?
We are probably going to delegate it to the existing mechanisms. It's a good question. Should we fix it?
I think we should not recreate the same situation without extreme caution. Sorry, Dan, you were going to say something, and I cut you off.
I was just going to say, it seems like we should have somebody write up a KEP, because this has a lot of intricacies and a couple of different options.
I mean, maybe before we do a KEP, we should just take it to a mailing list thread.
Sure.
Andrew, are you the champion for this, or are you just chiming in because you happen to know something about it?
I'm just chiming in, but I can start a thread, or maybe Jay can start a thread. But yeah, we'll follow up.
Please do.
Thanks.
Okay. Next up, Surya.
Yeah, so Dan already spoke about this, and a few of you have also spoken about this. Basically, I came across a bug where the user was having multiple cluster ciders, and our plugin was trying to call kubeproxy for the local traffic detection, and it wasn't working, obviously. I was pointed to the specification that I've linked in the agenda. I thought it was implemented, like Antonio helped me verify that it's not. So as per the proposal, we should be supporting cluster cider, node cider, interface, or bridge. But today, I think we support only the cluster and node cider. I'm still not sure if it's fully supported or not. I'm quite new to the project, so I might need help verifying that. And also the CLI part, according to the implementation, there's also a CLI part, but I don't really care about the CLI part, honestly. If I can just get the implementation to support any of these, it would be great. And if not, and if the suggestion is that plugins which support multiple cluster ciders should have their own implementation, then I can probably also go that way.
I assume you're talking about the one that Satya wrote. I can't load it right now for some reason.
Yes, yeah, it's that one.
Okay. So yeah, he wrote it, if I recall, he wrote it so that there were lots of possible avenues to do it, but only implemented unique, which is, I guess, par for the course. I think node cider is done, but we should probably double check. So would node cider be sufficient for what you're doing?
I don't think so. I mean, we discussed this, and our plugin does not really leverage, because node cider is actually using the node.spec.pod ciders or cider, the
Right.
spec field, and we don't leverage that as of today. So we were actually looking to either have the interface thing implemented, which is what Dan Winship suggested, or maybe even the bridge for that matter.
Okay. Yeah, I think I'm sure that he did not implement the interface prefix or bridge.
Yeah.
I would love to see those implemented. I remember reviewing that doc and being happy that there was a lot of room left for different ideas there. So is it reasonable to say PR is welcome, or are you looking at us to implement?
I'm okay either ways. I can take some time to implement this. It's just that I'm quite new, so it might take some time, and I might be bugging people a lot. But if that's okay, I can take this up.
That's fine. Welcome to the team. It's totally fine to be new and ask questions.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I can take this up.
All right, thanks. Next, DNS for cluster IP services and SRV records.
Hey, this is Harry. So I talked about this problem to, I think, Bowie and Rob. The problem we have is we have a cluster IP service, and an in-cluster component wants to route traffic directly to pod IPs, so the endpoints of the services. But and we cannot use any of the Kube APIs, so you cannot talk to the API server. So we want to solve this problem using DNS. The way to solve it is not use a cluster IP service. So I think that's called headless service, which creates a SRV records for each named port on the service, on the pods.
Right.
So what I wanted to know was is there scope for addition of SRV records for cluster IP services so that any component running inside the cluster can route traffic directly to an endpoint of the service? Is that like a really bad idea we shouldn't entertain? Is that something that can be entertained and requires more discussion? Or I'm trying to either figure out, like, is that something worth discussing, opening an issue?
You want to go directly to the pods of the service, not through the VIP.
Correct.
But the service was declared with a VIP.
Correct. And some components, the reason being here, some components might want to talk to cluster IP, while some components, especially in the case of components similar to ingress controllers, where they don't want to actually be talking to the endpoints API, but they just want to forward traffic and just use DNS to configure where to forward traffic to and skip kube proxy.
Didn't the old kubedns do this? Like it created a separate name for each service that resolved to each of the pod IPs rather than directing to the service IP?
It did create the names, but you had to know what they were in order to look them up, because any query for the service name would give you the service's own records, right?
No, but there was like a service name -endpoints record that it created or something, I thought.
Oh, really?
That's not documented anywhere as far as I know.
Yeah, you might be right. I don't recall that. But my memory is terrible. So Harry, the issue that I am worried about is the service author specifically said, I want this to be a VIP. And if we offer any record at the service's name that is different than that, it seems counter to what the user asked for.
That's a good point. Yeah, so the problem here is, like, some components want to talk via the web, while some components talk directly. So like we are asking users to configure a headless service, and that in that route the anyone can look up their survey record and go from there. But that's not an option. Everybody wants a cluster IP just to be a good fallback.
Dan, remind me, doesn't the OpenShift implementation also expose the naked endpoints at like .ept.cluster.local or something like that?
Maybe that's what I was thinking. Maybe it was an OpenShift thing, because I guess we weren't actually running kubedns before core DNS. We were running DNS mask directly.
Yeah, you did something wicked yourself.
Maybe that was just an OpenShift specific thing that I was thinking of, but I don't know if we do that with core DNS.
Yeah, and it's certainly not part of the DNS specification. But maybe it should be. I mean, it doesn't sound egregious on its face. We'd have to think about scalability. We're effectively multiplying the number of records core DNS is going to manage.
Can you re-summarize the solution? I kind of lost that track.
Yeah, sorry. Instead of resolving, foobar.mynamespace.service.cluster.local, you would resolve foobar.mynamespace.ept.cluster.local. And it would give you the raw endpoints without the VIP.
Interesting.
But it means that every VIP service would now have to manage all the endpoints individually, which is going to be a large increase in the resource footprint of DNS.
That makes sense.
But I would be okay to explore the idea. I don't have any bandwidth myself to try to write it up or do some exploration. Do you, Harry, or are you looking for somebody here to step up?
No, I'm happy to add in whatever I can do on my part. But what would be a good way? Like start a Google Doc and sort of socialize that amongst SIG Network? Or?
Either start a doc or start a mailing list thread that explains what you're trying to do and what doesn't work currently, and then we could brainstorm ideas and trade-offs about performance and resource footprint.
Got it. Okay, so let me start a mailing list thread, and sort of once that dies down, I can convert that into a doc, and then we can go from there.
Okay.
Thanks for the input here.
All right.
Do we have time to do Sergey, or are we going to boot him? Sergey, are you here?
If we can make it quick.
Yeah, I will try to make it quick. So there is a very, I don't think it's a complicated issue, like small PR that I would love somebody from this group to review. It requires kubelet approvers, but it's clearly SIG network related. The reason I came here is I wanted to ask what the best practices and like maybe some standards how like kubelet operates with CNI. In this particular case, the duplication of not port mapping happens in kubelet and then passed to CNI. So I was wondering, do we need to have the deduplication logic at all on kubelet side, or we need to pass it to CNI and like forget about it? So if there are any opinions on best practices, it would be great.
Sorry, I'm looking at the PR that you linked. Didn't I already review a PR that looked very much like this?
Yeah, this is a restart of PRs that got rotten. So I just restarted it. And I cleaned up some logic around this PR as well. So there were a lot of questions in previous PR, how name is used, how how kubelet configures not port mapping. And I removed all this legacy code, so it's much easier to review now.
Okay. So my response is the same as with the other PR, which I think it seems okay, but I don't know the internals of how the CRI implementations use this string. And so I'm a little bit afraid of that. But you know CRI's internals better than I do at this point.
So this name doesn't leak from this function at all. So this function go through not port mapping in a port definition and then can like deduplicate ports. So if not port mapping already exists, then it wouldn't add this not port mapping for CNI to be configured to configure it.
Okay, I see. That does seem really simple compared. I seem to recall the other PR being more complicated than that. Did I just make a mistake?
No, it was a lot of legacy logic. I think before that, some logic was using this name, and that's why it was passed from this function back. Now this name is not needed at all, so I just simplified the logic around.
I see. Okay. Well, that sounds a lot more approachable.
Yeah, and the question is it normal that deduplication happens in kubelet, or we need to move this deduplication logic somewhere in CNI? And yeah, I don't know.
What kind of deduplication are we talking about here, though?
So this is host port mapping. So the mapping not port to container port, and if port definition has multiple mappings that are matching that are exactly the same, then only one will be used. Only one will be passed to CNI. My question, and warning will be reported to customer. Like it's a warning log message. So the question is, do we need this logic at all, or we just pass all the port mappings to CNI as is, and CNI will figure out how to do deduplication better?
Okay. I guess we should continue this in the issue. I mean, I don't see a particular problem in CNIs and CRIs, and I was just looking at the cryo implementation. I don't think it would have a problem with having multiple host ports mapped to the same container port.
Yeah, but then like this is fine. This is addresses this
right.
PR, but then next question would be, do we need this deduplication logic at all? Would the CRI and CNI be fine if same mapping will be asked to be configured twice?
I would think that we would somehow reject that in the Kubernetes API validation if we try to do the same thing twice in a pod spec. But I could be wrong.
Do we not already? We don't already validate that you use the same. Basically, Sergey, you're saying the user used the same host port twice, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which that seems like it should be an error.
Supposedly, but right now we just log warning.
Really? I think we've got two separate issues. Like one, it seems to be okay to use multiple host ports for the same. Multiple host ports for the same container port. And I guess it's allowed everywhere except deep inside kubelet. So we should probably just allow that and add a test for it. The second is a different question.
So first one, if you're fine with that, I would appreciate review and LGTM on pull request. And for second one, I can just leave it as is, or I can keep pursuing it and maybe file a bug to discuss.
Sure. If you use the same host port twice in a single pod and it doesn't fail, that I would say that's a bug, and you should file an issue and we can talk about it.
No, it was deduplicated, so there wasn't error. But okay,
sorry,
I can file a bug.
Yeah, if a user does it and it doesn't fail for them, we should talk about it. Like, we may not be able to fix it at this point, unfortunately. It may just be too much of a breaking change, but we should file it as a bug and discuss how to deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that was it
Cool.
from my side. But
Thank you.
if you need more information, let me know.
Okay. We are way over time. So unless somebody has something absolutely important, let's punt anything else to next time.
May I say something about the load balancer IP? Just to finalize. I would like to remove the validation things from the protocol, because I believe it shouldn't be validated since it's an agreement between the user and the cloud provider. Kubernetes shouldn't put restrictions on it. But I can take that in the PR.
Can you, Lars, can you file a separate bug on that? Basically, you're saying the validation that was added was wrong, right?
No, for the array with different addresses, load balancer IPs, Kubernetes shouldn't validate that they belong to different families and that kind of things. It could be 5 IPv6 addresses, isn't it perfectly fine if the cloud provider can provide those addresses?
Okay, let's discuss it on the PR then, on a CAP PR, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
We do.
Perfect.
All right. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.
Thanks all.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
See y'all.